It helps to know what a phone bridge is. A phone bridge is a connection of many different phone lines, usually with some sort of integrating technology. So you connect to it and then it puts you into a conference. There might even be a way to press a number and get out of the conference, but in its entirety, it's just a phone conference. It's just a way to connect everything. It was my 17th year, 1987, so phone conferences were a bit of a novelty, and I'd been on a few, and they were exciting. And using a variety of methodologies, I was able to make phone calls essentially for free. Now, I couldn't tell you how I got this number, but I got a number up in New Hampshire, and I was calling into New Hampshire, and there was this phone conference, and the phone conference was full of teenagers from the local high school. Time and perspective have told me that it was either some sort of promotional attempt or maybe some sort of test, and just let it rip. Because let it rip, it did. It was clearly a chaotic kind of integration into the local high school. And I was there on it because I'd heard this number, and I was more than happy to listen in for hours while people talked about things only germane to this one town in New Hampshire. And again, the time has gotten so far. It's been decades. I could not tell you 40 plus years ago how I found out about Jamie. But Jamie was on these conferences, and Jamie and I started talking, and for whatever reason, we really, really connected. I basically fell in love with Jamie, and I think she fell in love with me in some way. And so began a very, very important lesson. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt, thanks to Jeff Atwood and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. Jamie lived in Concord, New Hampshire. She actually mailed me pictures of herself smiling in this room full of lots of different posters of rock stars of the 1980s. A very interesting and strange room that really connected with my strange, composed room. We talked a lot. We talked an enormous amount, and while it wasn't realistic to call it a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, it was definitely something special, something involving friendship and closeness, and maybe even promises heard one way or another. And I thought about Jamie a lot, and it was very unrealistic for me to go from New York to Concord, New Hampshire under any real circumstance. I didn't have any friends who would possibly drive me up there. I wasn't comfortable taking buses of unknown determination, something I'd never done before anyway. And so we talked a lot and left it at that. But I was going to college in Boston. Boston was on the horizon, and so while we continued to talk here and there, I did go to summer school in Boston, and then ultimately I was a student, a freshman at Emerson College. Again, this relationship was what you would call virtual. It was just words and occasionally letters and photographs sent in the mail. It was in some ways extraordinarily real, and in other ways not real at all. I lived a different life, different from what Jamie was, and I'm sure, well, maybe I'm not sure what Jamie thought of me. But the faithful day came that we talked, and I realized I could get to Concord in a relatively short period of time taking a bus. Again, all new to me, 18 years old, taking some sort of transportation to go from one place to another. It felt interesting and unusual and weird and exciting and terrifying. I ended up going after the end of classes on a Friday, meaning to meet Jamie at the Concord bus station. I took this bus ride, this nighttime travel, going not that many miles, but enough for a couple of hours as we stopped at different towns along the way. And I felt like I was truly on an adventure, a world that I lived online and on the phone, a world that was in some ways more real than the world I was living, even though I was living in that real world. And eventually I found myself in Concord, New Hampshire, having accomplished that goal. I had gone past my areas of comfort. I had made the journey, and I was going to see Jamie. Now, Jamie wasn't there. Somebody else was there. I forget his name. And he explained to me that it wasn't a good idea for me to meet Jamie at this time, and she was a little bit uncomfortable, and that they were working to find a place to put me. That is, at some point from when I left and everything was okay to when I arrived, it was a different set of reality, and I was going to have to be housed somewhere. And what ended up happening was, after some negotiations between this person and a few other people he knew, I was put into an apartment in downtown Concord, where this apartment, well, maybe you've seen these kinds of apartments. The buildings are very low, not built very well. They have a sense of tar paper shack about them, a sense of everything kind of being thrown together really quickly to be able to rent the apartments to whoever can pay the small amount of money that it costs to rent them. I remember this apartment being very small, the kind where if you lay in bed, you could see the sink. And I remember that it was really messy. For some reason, I clearly remember that there were Flaming Carrot comics, but I don't remember much else. This was the apartment of a single man who had a basic job, who could stay with a friend for Friday night, and then allow me, a stranger, to stay there and not really feel like he was putting much at risk. I think about that night. Jamie ended up having a letter given to me that was slipped under the door of this apartment. And the letter basically explained that she was not ready, didn't want to talk about all this, and that she was so sorry that I had come all this way for nothing. Let's not portray me entirely as a gullible victim or some sort of downtrodden person for taking a whole bus ride into Concord. But I was 18. Which means I did go to where she worked, which was a fast food restaurant. And I remember I made some sort of scene. I remember standing in line and being very displeased with her. I do not recall being threatening or particularly scary, but I'm sure nobody likes having a betrayed, sad, depressed 18-year-old in the lobby of their fast food job. Whatever scene I made had to have been some sort of half-baked, arm-waving declaration of complete and utter sadness before storming off, waiting for a bus, and making my way back to Boston that day. That was an incredibly painful experience. I think you can see why I don't talk about it all that much. But I look back on it now, 40 years later, and I think about what I learned from it. What lessons did I get? Well, the first was never to treat something I found online as being as real and meaningful as something offline. It was never going to be the case that I didn't meet somebody first before having some sort of declarative feelings going on. I would take it light. I would take it simple. I would be interested in meeting people in various ways, but I would never consider it done a done deal until circumstances made it real. Perhaps I built a little bit less trust from that, a little bit less of completely investing myself in virtual ideas, maybe focusing more on what I knew to be actual, what I knew to be feelings that came from a real place, and then be lightly surprised at what came back. But I learned another lesson, too. I learned about taking those risks, taking those jumps. Even though I took a whole ride out from Boston to Concord via bus, I came back whole. I didn't come back damaged or hurt or poor or wounded. I came back with disappointment, like going to a park and finding it was closed, or finally getting into a restaurant and finding the meal wasn't up to what I had been promised. I had experienced a kind of romantic hype cycle, this idea that I was going to find a partner, a life journey that just didn't take off, just left me kind of at the launch pad. I'm not here to blame Jamie. I'm not here to indicate in some way that maybe I made leaps of logic and shouldn't have. Maybe Jamie felt she couldn't say no. Maybe she felt that this person was visiting and that felt like a lot of commitment and why not do it? And then she realized that she was making a mistake and she was able to call it off as best as she could. I don't know. But what it means is that in the years hence, the decades hence, I have been much more alert to when people fill in the blanks, when people have no evidence for their feelings, for their assumptions, for the actions they're going to take. I lost a friendship over that, somebody who was a real joy to talk to, but who had decided that they needed to go to an event to fix a problem that, frankly, to me, didn't make any sense, putting that much time and travel because they had decided what needed to be done. And I said, I don't think that's what you need to be doing here. And they never talked to me again. But I'm happy that I said it. I was right, and maybe that doesn't matter in the long term. But not speaking out and not using what you learn in life means you're not contributing to it. I'll tell you now, I have taken many journeys not knowing what's at the end of it. I have had some end positively and some end negatively. I have had terrible times. I have had once-in-a-lifetime times. What I learned was not to assume. But what I also learned was sometimes, the risk, the effort, the leap into the unknown will yield the greatest and most amazing rewards. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It. Thanks to James Bekoyanu, Ernie Hershey, Michael Rubin, Dilip Reddy, Sean Kelly, Trixie the Cat, Joey Mink, Martin, Symbionts, Benjamin Guts, and Anonymous, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. I have thought about Jamie maybe a half dozen times since my 20s. I'm fine. And wherever she is, I almost guarantee Jamie's doing fine too. But I'm not going to find out.